Hi friends, it's Shari. Today I'm making a really fun Halloween peekaboo pop-up card using a bunch of different stamp sets and some really fun ink blending. I'm using the Happy Haunting stamp set. This is older, but I really love that haunted house. It's one of my favorites, so I'm happy to be using that again. I'm using Booyah for one of the ghosts. I'll also use that little pirate hat to decorate one of my characters that's trick-or-treating. I'm going to be using the fox costumes before and after for that skeleton fox, a couple of the little birds, and then I'll be using Jump for Joy for the owl. He's the one that's going to be wearing that pirate hat. And then I'm also going to use another older set that is spooktacular for the sentiment and also that little tombstone. And I wanted to show you the inspiration for the colors on my card today is this piece of fabric. It has these cute little critters trick-or-treating, but I really love like the blue houses and the orange background. It's just a different kind of color scheme for a Halloween card. So of course I'm going to be coloring my house in those blue colors, and I am starting out with a B23 and a B21. So of course I'm using that darker color for my more shadow areas, and then I blend it out with that lighter color. I'll be using these two as the base of all the faces of the house. So you can see I've put that darker color up under the eave where the shadow might be, and then I will pull it down with that B21. And I'll fill in this whole face with that B21. Then I'll go back in with the B23 and add some darkness. So under the eave, kind of up on the sides, and then underneath the roof of the porch. And I colored the edge of the roof with a dark blue, but I decided I wanted it to be black, so I'm going back in with black. And then I'm going to apologize for my head here. This was me trying to figure out why my marker was not coloring very well. That B14 that I started with is bone dry once I weighed it afterwards, so I apologize for my head being in the way. So I have that B26 that I have drawn across the lines or the detail lines on the front of the face of the house. You can see how that darkened them up on that piece on the left. And then of course I'm using the same colors for the piece on the right. I just did not color it earlier because I wasn't sure if I wanted to make it a different color or make it all blue. And I decided to just stick with all blue because I'm going to have a lot of colors happening on this card. So I'm just going in again and adding some more shadows where those parts of the house kind of come together. And then this is where I went back to the porch and added some shading in because it's under that roof and it just looked too light once I had colored all the other parts. Now I'm using a pale purple for the windows, and then I'll use a green for the door just for something different. And then I'm using some gray for that stone chimney, just some toner grays, and I'll use those same grays for the front of the porch as well. So I'm not doing too much shading, but I will do a little bit so that it's not too light. Pulling in that dark, and then I'll go back with the light and blend it out. And then of course I colored the steps and the porch the same. You can see that green door there. I will go back to that and add a little bit at the end to make it look a little more three-dimensional. But I'm moving on to my tombstones. I'm using some warm gray, and then I pulled in a blue violet, really pale, to kind of give it a purpley hue. And then I'll go back with my dark warm gray and add in my shadows. Now for my characters, I'm moving on to my little fox here. And I'll just use two colors to color the top of his head so that he has some shading. So I have that YR14, and then I'm going to pull in a YR27 for the darker color. Just pull it up from his nose up into his ears a little bit and then blend it out. For the rest of his face, I like to use this E000 when you want a white that is a little bit of a creamy color. And I'll be using that same thing for the skull on this pirate hat that I'm coloring. So I'm carefully tracing around that skull because it's kind of small, and then I'm going to come in with a slightly darker red and just do the littlest bit of shading along the bottom. And then here I am with that E000, just adding a little bit of color to that skull so it's not stark white. I also have this cute little trick-or-treat bag that is also from the Fox costume set, and my owl's going to be carrying that. And I'm coloring that and the little bird that's dressed up like a pumpkin, which I just think is adorable. With those same oranges, a yellow for the bird, I did color a little bit of green on the stem of the pumpkin hat that he's wearing. And then of course for my ghost, I'm using some cool grays. And you can see I just traced that little bird that's dressed up like a ghost just slightly. And then for the big ghost, I'm tracing all the way around. And then I'm going to come in with an even lighter one and sort of blend it out a little bit more. So this keeps it white, but also gives it some shading. Now I'm moving on to my owl. So I have that E00 for his face and his belly. Adding some orange for his beak and his feet, and then I'll come in with some browns for the rest of his body. I'm starting out with this E15, and then I'll pull in a darker one to give him some shading and darken him up a little bit. They are trick-or-treating at night, so I don't want them to be too terribly bright, but I do want this to be a nice colorful card. And then here is where I revisit my door and add a little bit more green, some darker spooky green in there. And I just think this is really fun. It has this kind of spooky glow. Then of course, I decided to add some little rosy cheeks to my ghost and my little bird dressed as a ghost. So I cut them all out with the coordinating dies and I'll set those aside, and then I can move on to the body of my card. I'm making a Peekaboo Pop-up card, so I'm using the dies to cut some Bristol cardstock. I'm going to cut 2 pieces, one for the back and one for the front, and we're going to do some ink blending on these. I'm going to turn these around. My fold on the background is going to be on the left, and on the front piece, it's going to be on the right. So I'm just writing front on this one towards the top, and I'm going to set that aside just so I don't get confused and I know which side I need to cut. Now I'm going to use some removable adhesive on the back and stick this to my media mat so that I can do some stenciling and some ink blending. I am going to pull out my ruler here, and I'm measuring. The folds are about 3/4 of an inch. I have 2 of those, so I know that when they're folded over and the card is closed, that about 2.5 inches in is where the side is going to fall. And I'm doing this so that I can make sure that when it's closed, I have an entire full moon, so it doesn't get cut off by the fold being folded over. So I'm just laying my ruler there. I'm not going to draw a line or anything. This is just sort of a guide, so I can see that my moon is you're going to see the whole thing when it's closed. So here's the colors I'm going to use for my background: saltwater taffy, ripe persimmon, and crackling campfire. Of course, I'm starting out with that saltwater taffy just right around the moon. Now I did put some removable adhesive on the back of that moon mask, but just to make sure nothing moves, I'm also adding my magnet. So I'm just putting that saltwater taffy around so I get this nice glow and lighter area around the moon. But the majority of this background is going to end up being these bright orange colors so that it matches my fabric that I'm using as my inspiration. So I'm just working between that saltwater taffy and that ripe persimmon to kind of blend out between the two so you get this nice transition between the lighter color and the darker color. Then I'm coming in with a lot of that ripe persimmon to kind of cover everything. And then I'll move on to crackling campfire, which is this really nice dark orange. And I think this really gives it that kind of dark, sort of spooky, Halloween-y look. And I apologize for going off the bottom of my screen here. I was just having really fun ink blending and not paying attention to what you could see on my camera. Now, a lot of that at the bottom is probably going to get covered up by the ground that I cut for the front panel. So I'm going to pull it into that right persimmon a little bit more. And then when you pull the moon off, you have this glowing moon. How cool is this? So I put my moon mask back on, and I'm going to add some splatters to the background. This time I usually use white watercolor, and I thought I would try some white distress paint to see if it gave me any brighter white speckles. And it did at first, but once they dried, I don't really think it was too much different than my white watercolors. But it's always good to try some new things sometimes. So that's what I'm doing, just adding a little bit of water to that white picket fence distress paint, picking it up with my paintbrush and just tapping it so I get some big white splatters. And then I'm going to go back to my black watercolor. I'm going to tap this off a block and get some really small splatters instead of those big droplets. So I've let that dry, let those splatters dry, and now I'm moving on to the front piece. Now I'm going to tell you right now, I cut this too short. So you're going to see me ink blend this piece, but when it came time to assemble, I realized it was too short and I cut another one. So I'm using Twisted Citron as the base color, and then I'll use some peeled paint at the top for some shadow. And I'm just going to go all over with this Twisted Citron. And I'll use a piece of scrap cardstock to kind of protect this from my fingerprints, because that ink sits on top of that Bristol cardstock a lot longer than it would. It doesn't absorb in, which helps you blend, but it also leaves fingerprints sometimes. I was even having a little trouble of the fingerprints sort of showing through my piece of paper. And then I'll move on to some peeled paint for the top. So this is kind of a darker, dirtier green color, and I think that really works for the kind of scene that I'm creating today. So I'm just putting that all along the top, and then I'll go back in with the Twisted Citron and blend it out. You can see I got some of that dark ink on my brush, but luckily it all blends out pretty easy. So you can see how that's going to look. But like I said, I am going to cut a different piece. Now I'm back to my moon stencil. Now that my background is dry, I wanted to add a little bit of color to the moon. I really like that bright white moon, but I just need to tone down the edge a little bit. So I am pulling out some squeezed lemonade distress ink, and I am just going to pull in some of that yellow from the edges, just slightly, so we get this nice glowy yellow look around the edges of the moon. And it just kind of softens that edge a little bit and really makes it look like it has some roundness to it. Then I'm pulling in that detail part of the stencil, and I'm going to use a Post-it note to mask off this edge that's really close, because I just don't want to run the risk of going over that edge with my ink. And then I'm using dried marigold, and I am doing this with a very, very, very light hand. You can see I'm picking up a little bit of ink and I'm even tapping it off, and I'm just trying to be very light-handed so I just get this really subtle detail look. And I think that turned out perfect. I'm really happy with that. Now for my sentiment. This is from that Spooktacular stamp set. This is one of my first stamp sets, and I still love this stamp set. I love the sentiments and the little mix of fonts and the way they're stacked. I just think they're perfect, and this fit in my moon perfectly. So I've got that in my Misty, and I'm just going to stamp that in my moon. And then next I'm going to add some black clouds. Why I still have this in my Misty, I'm not sure, instead of pulling it out and putting it on my media station, but they're both magnetic, so I guess it works. So what's cool about this long cloud here is, just by chance, when I placed it here and it folded over, it almost lined up perfectly to where when it's folded closed, it looks like one cloud without a break, and when it's open, it's also one cloud without a break. So that was just a happy accident, but it works perfectly. I'm using Distress Oxide for this instead of the regular ink because it has that pigment property and it's going to cover up and sit on top of my other colors nicely. And this is, of course, black soot, so I get these black clouds. And then I'm using the other two on the other side. So I'll just line those up, hold it in place with my magnet. Again, I'm not sure why I left this in my Misty. You could do this on your media mat as well. And I'm blocking off all those things I want to make sure I don't accidentally ink up so that I only get the clouds. And I just think these black clouds on that sky are so striking. It's so much fun. I love it. So I'm really pleased with my background. Now for the mechanism for the Peekaboo Pop-up. I have cut this from acetate. This is Lawn Fawn acetate. It is very thick. So I am trying to fold this and make sure I really fold those folds. And then I'm putting a piece of adhesive onto the piece that will attach to my card. And I have this practice piece, and this is the way I am checking to make sure I put the adhesive on the right triangle. And I did. So here is my taller piece. The piece I originally cut was too short to hide the ghost and the mechanism once it was in the closed position. I'm just going to do my Z fold for that front piece and then my Z fold for that back piece. And this is where you're going to see that that cloud almost matches up perfectly when it's closed. And then when it's open, it extends, which I just think is so fun. Now to adhere my arm on, and I'm just checking my practice piece over there to make sure that I've got it all lined up correctly. And you can see there how it pops up. I'm going to make sure that's stuck down really well. I did actually add some more glue dots to it to make it stick down really well. Now to adhere that front piece to the back piece, I added some double-sided adhesive tape, but also some liquid glue so that when it dries, it's nice and sturdy. And I'll do the same thing to this side as well. And a lot of times I do this with the liquid glue when I am taping or adhering things to things that have been inked, especially on a smooth surface like Bristol. I just want to make sure it sticks down really well. And now that front piece is all lined up with that other corner and everything's working pretty well. So I'm going to add my ghost, and I'm using glue dots since I am adhering this to a piece of acetate. So I'm adding 2 glue dots, and then I will just stick my little ghost onto this acetate arm that's sticking up. And I'm putting it in the open position so I can see sort of where it's going to line up. I want it to be sort of in the middle of the moon underneath the sentiment. That is so cute and so much fun. Now I can add my house, which I'm making sure I add glue only where it's going to touch that piece to the far left and the ground below. I want to make sure I don't have any glue on that part that overlaps the back piece so that everything still moves correctly. And now I can move on to my trick-or-treaters. So I'm adding that pirate hat to my owl. I just think it's really fun that all the hats in the Booyah stamp set can be used for other critters and characters. This allowed me to have different critters trick-or-treating, not just the fox that was in all the costumes in that stamp set. I have a pirate owl now too. So I'm just going to lay these out so that they fall in a good place. I'm going to let his trick-or-treat bag sort of overhang that fold a little bit. And that little ghost bird, he's going to be hiding so that he kind of appears when the card gets opened. So I'll just use liquid glue to adhere all of these down. And I'm making sure that I don't have glue on his trick-or-treat bag because that's overlapping my fold line there. I'm going to hide my little ghost bird back here so that you can't see him when it's closed and he appears when it gets opened. And then of course this cute little pumpkin bird. And then of course I have those tombstones I colored. I'm actually only going to use one. I colored two, but once I kind of got these on here, I thought that two was a little bit too much. So I just left it at one. And then here is my finished card. I did go back in with some black Stickles glitter glue and add that to the tops of the clouds and the house. And I did this and let it dry because you don't want to play with this while it's drying because that ghost moves and I don't want it to catch on any of that glitter. So here is my finished card. I just think it's so much fun. I really love the colors and how it turned out. Again, I think it's fun to look at other things for color inspiration and kind of get out of your normal color palette and try something new that is not quite the traditional Halloween colors. So here is another look at those cards, and when you pull it open, I love that little ghost that just comes out from behind the house. It's just so much fun. Thanks so much for watching. Have an amazing day. Bye.